Alliances Engineer. Before we begin today, I'd like to remind the audience to please feel free to submit questions throughout the event using your question chat box that's on your webinar toolbar. Our speaker will leave some time throughout and at the end of the presentation to address your questions. For any GoToWebinar related questions, please use your chat box. Following the event, a survey will appear and you will have the opportunity to evaluate today's webinar. We do thank you in advance for your feedback. So now I would like to turn the call over to today's presenter. Please go ahead, Jake.
Thank you, Renee. So again, we're going to chat about protecting your organization with Threat Lifecycle Management. And I'll go into an agenda in a moment, but some of that is a workflow for handling threats, alarms, incidences within your environment, right? So the bad guys, the attackers, they get a life cycle. If you're Lockheed Martin, they have a trademark term for it that you can use. But as a blue team, we need a broad overall framework. Specifics are going to be different from environment to environment, but it's important that we have a similar life cycle to work with to make sure things don't slip through the cracks. So first, about me. I work with the Technology Alliances team here at LogRhythm, and that's basically making sure that I work with the vendors that you guys use and make sure we're integrating the right way and coming up with useful tools for our common customer base. So I've been making computers talk to each other in some way, shape, or form since about the mid-'80s. I've been getting paid for it since about the mid-'90s, and throughout the 2000s have really been security focused. And in the last 4 or 5 years, really focusing on data, sometimes even things that don't generate data, but getting something out of a service or a product that can then be made actionable and useful for the SOC, right? So I've been blue team focused my entire career, and it's really about enabling those incident handlers to do their job effectively. So quick agenda. I'm going to touch on the threat landscape. Most of you are probably familiar with a good chunk of this, but it helps to level set, get in the right mind frame for how we're going to look at threat lifecycle management. I'll talk a little bit about our Palo Alto integration, where we are now and where we'd like to head, and that will segue into next generation current SIEMs and how they can empower organizations and data lakes, and some of what we can do with that, how to be successful with some of that. So we'll start with a pretty familiar slide, the modern cyber threat pandemic, right? It goes back up about 10 years, and we have a pretty steady scale of the number and the scope of data breaches. And this ends in 2016. So this doesn't even cover, Yahoo pivoting from, what was it, about 1 billion accounts compromised to now 3+, their entire user base. Equifax isn't covered in here. Anything that came out in the last 11.5 months, isn't even covered. But this gives us a good idea of the trend, right? So that, especially in the breach side, that attack life cycle, the modern threat takes time if we're looking at something extensive like that. But this life cycle also applies on a micro scale, even if it's just a ransomware attack on a singular system, right? A little bit of reconnaissance and planning has to go into it, even if that's just dropping a malicious ad with the right provider. An initial compromise has to occur within that target. That foothold needs to know what to do next. That's where we are command and control. Look around, figure out what the next step is, and then take that step. And then finally, target attainment and then end goal, right? Whether that's exfiltrating data or encrypting, corrupting that, and then working with it, right? Each of these phases, each of these activities can have the potential to leave behind a forensic trail. And so the more visibility you have, the sooner in that that cycle, you can catch it and potentially disrupt it and minimize damage, right? So and that's where we get, you know, our maturity model, and we get better protection through faster detection and response, right? So previously, attacker dwell time was well over half a year. I actually saw a post this morning that it's trickled down to about 89 days, I believe, which, you know, it's a short jump from the last report, but that's the right trend. That's what we want to see, right? And so with faster detection and response, that allows us to minimize the impact of these attacks. And there's been a strategic shift towards that, right? Towards getting better visibility, better detection within our environments. And IT budgets are starting to reflect that, and the tools and capability that you guys are getting is really indicative of where we're heading with that now. So what are our obstacles to faster detection and response, right? What's holding us back? Some big ones, alarm fatigue, right? As we get more visibility, as more things are generating log data, and we start bringing in new data sets that are security relevant, but maybe we weren't able to before, say, physical controls, alarm systems, IoT, SCADA, et cetera. You know, that's generating more stuff that trickles up that we then have to deal with. There's the swivel chair analysis. So without a trusted centralized place for all of our risk-based monitoring, people have to look at multiple dashboards. We have to spend time in a variety of different products and interfaces investigating this data, and then trying to manually piece things together. And so it's more tools people have to be trained on, more people involved, and more opportunity for, you know, fat fingering something or copying and pasting the wrong thing. With that, we've also got forensic data silos, right? So without a consolidated collection framework, most of the commonly needed data kind of sits where it's generated or somewhere associated with that, right? So all of your syslog data is going to sit at a syslog aggregator, but if you're staying native, most of that's going to be in Linux tools. If you've got, you get a similar situation with Windows event logs, right? And if you're lucky enough to have network monitoring infrastructure and actually storing those packets, that's a whole other location and data set to kind of have to track and maintain, right? And so having to dip into all of these silos takes time and stretches out how long it takes to investigate something and move on to remediation. With that gives us a fragmented workflow, right? Without a formal process in place and trying to stitch together all of these tools, you get a lot of drastically inefficient, or at least subtly inefficient processes, right? Threats can slip through the cracks as you move data around, whether it's through spreadsheets or wikis or email. And then some things might get forgotten or not fully investigated or taken all the way to resolution, right? And then there's also a lack of automation, right? So organizations are looking for effective ways to automate routine incident response actions, right? Bringing in contextual data from outside sources, trying to get additional context from internal sources, conducting investigations across multiple people or larger teams. So it means that fewer investigations can be done, and the incidences you have can become all-consuming, and you end up missing other things that deserve attention. So effective threat lifecycle management as a process should address these obstacles and enable a faster detection and response for your environment, right? We want to do more with the people that we have, make them more efficient, and keep them from having to do a lot of the manual, mundane work that's just adding data for our lifecycle management. Right, and where does that start? That primarily starts with data collection, right? In order to detect something and then respond to it, in order to detect it, we have to see it, right? So we're going to bring in, we need to bring in log and machine data from across the environment, whether it's security relevant, or we're finding more and more that non-security relevant data as we do deeper behavioral analytics is still useful for looking for anomalies and deciding whether or not something needs to be looked at more closely. We also need to bring in forensic sensor data, right? Sensor data is where maybe something doesn't necessarily generate a log. Endpoint activity is a good example. You know, your standard Windows system is not telling you about every process and DLL call that comes up. But we have, you know, endpoint detection systems that can, whether you're paying for something like Carbon Black or CrowdStrike, or you're looking at free tools like Microsoft's Sysmon, and our own system monitor can put all that together and feed it into that forensic architecture. So once we have that data, we need to discover our threats, right? We do that with analytics, whether that's search-based human threat hunting analytics or machine algorithms looking for patterns or certain behaviors. We use scenario-based analytics, and so we look for things like you know, a user being created, and then that user being added to an administrative group, and then that account being deleted within a short period of time is indicative of bad behavior. But once these alarms pop up, we need to qualify that threat, right? We need to qualify that alarm, right? Assess that threat. Is it applicable in my environment? Is it a threat, right? How risky is it? You know, is it going to have a broad range of impact, or is it only going to be able to access a small amount of data stored in the DMZ that we don't care about? And that will lead to whether or not a full investigation is necessary, right? If we have to go that route, we want to dig deeper on that threat. We need to analyze it deeply, make sure that we've got rapid access to all of the forensic data so that we can paint a full picture of what's going on. And in order to determine the nature, the scale, and scope of an incident, we want to be able to take a look at key things like an endpoint or a user and find out, you know, what else have they done either on that device or throughout the entire network, and do that in a way that we don't need to know the specifics of our data, but we just need to know in a nutshell what we're looking for. Take this user and show me all of the authentication activity across my entire network, whether it's a Windows box or a Linux box or my network elements. Excuse me. Once we've fully investigated that, or sometimes qualification allows us to skip the investigation phase and move right on to neutralize, right? We're going to want to implement countermeasures. In the case of Palo Alto, right, add a suspicious IP address to a block list, or you know, look for a particular hash within our environment or something. And we want to mitigate that activity, shut it down, and prevent further damage, right? So this neutralize phase, we could stop something that's just in lateral movement before they've gotten target attainment, which means someone hasn't looked at the keys to the kingdom yet and potentially exfiltrated, right? So minimize that damage. So the sooner we can see an attack, the quicker we can respond to it. You know, maybe if we see a process that's creating files with lots of entropy, we want to go over and tip over that process. That's you know, with other corroborated evidence that could be a piece of ransomware. And we want to minimize the damage that can cause. After that, we move on to recovery, right? That's our last step in the workflow. We need to clean up, perform an after-action report, you know, maybe wipe and reload any endpoints involved, or call in legal. Our after-action report may look at the step-by-step processes that we took and which things were manual. Do we have any new tools, or the capabilities of our existing tools change any, so that we can change this process or automate new things, and the next time a similar event occurs, we can respond and remediate quicker, right? So you can put all of this together with a combination of disparate systems, right? You can have all the tools in your environment, plug them together, but this requires some complex API level integrations, requires a workflow potentially across multiple interfaces, and can lead to lots of duplication, right? This can result in inefficiencies across the people and the process and technologies that you use. So our approach is to tie all of this together into a single platform, user interface, where we can cover the full threat lifecycle, right? So we have end-to-end workflow of these phases, and that leads to faster teams, right? So that way, everyone's working in one interface. You don't need to cross-train people on new tools that come up. And when you're collaborating, everyone gets to look at the same data. It can flow into cases and incidents as it occurs. It makes it very easy to transition and or delegate duties. So with that we have multiple integration points that kind of we map to our threat lifecycle management workflow, right? A couple of API level integrations, Smart Response, which is our gateway to the command line, the threat intelligence service that lets us pull in external context and feed the analytics, as well as give analysts outside information right in their alarms so that they can make quicker decisions, all the way down to data in and data out, right? Our machine data collection, where we're bringing in logs and forensic evidence, and then taking that and feeding it back out to other tools with our log distribution services. And we can now do that with our fully normalized taxonomy, which I'll touch on in a bit when we speak to data lakes. So Palo Alto, our integration with Palo Alto. Right now, of course, we're bringing that data in, and this is typical firewall log entry. We're going to normalize that across our taxonomy. As I said, I'll bring that in later, but we take that data and we make it a little more human friendly, right? We give it some directionality, we apply some context to it, and then put things within our taxonomy so that you can go and look for a specific classification, like allowed network traffic, which direction did it go, what users were involved, and whether or not that's a security relevant event or just operations. And then we have our Smart Response, where we can use Palo Alto's API to ask the platform to do something for us, right? So where does that fit with us? Well, the Palo Alto fits squarely within 4 of the 6 portions of our workflow, right? It helps us detect and qualify events with, we've got a couple of targeted dashboards for Palo Alto data, and we can use that to enable threat hunters to drill down on that data and find interesting things in their environment, things that maybe they know doesn't feel quite right, and or dig around and look for those kind of needles in a haystack that only they know because of their domain awareness within your organization, right? And then of course we use our machine analytics to power alarms, and once those alarms, you can drill down and see a similar kind of dashboard and or raw log view from the previous screenshot. But as we're working that alarm, we can enable a SOC analyst with fully automated or multiple levels of human approval. So tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, or supervisor, right, may have to go through different chains of approval to go ahead and ask the Palo Alto to, in this case, add an IP address to a threat list or to a block list. And then that goes out through the API, pushes that in, and helps mitigate that threat as quick as possible. So we do that right now with Wildfire and the next-gen firewall data, and portions of the IPS is currently in development with our parsing work. Further down on the roadmap, we're working on traps and endpoint security, so traps data and aperture visibility, so that you can keep an eye on what's going on in your cloud SaaS environment, box telemetry, etc. And then as we move forward and the application framework gets turned up and available, that's going to be another path for data within or to the SIEM, and we'll also be able to integrate that with Smart Response and use the application framework to leverage some of that automation orchestration. One of the other things the application framework is going to enable for us is an additional data path, right? So we are looking, or we have new ways to leverage portions of our SIEM platform within your environment, right? So our new Cloud AI, or User and Entity Behavior Analytics platform, is now available as like a standalone service where you have just enough of our the forensic portion of our SIEM capability to feed that into a standalone UEBA offering. And the application framework will allow us to directly pull Palo Alto relevant data into that. And that's a good segue into how we envision data lakes, right? Because in a nutshell, that's what enables that advanced analytics, some of the predictive and analytics and modeling that we're doing, right? And so, you know, this is kind of how we envision data lakes, right? Enterprises are moving towards more data-specific decision making, right? It's a deeper part with how they're doing business, and all of that data is no longer sitting around somewhere. They're looking at ways to leverage that and make better decisions for the enterprise as a whole. And we're working with some large enterprises as well as some managed security service providers and some systems integrators to build some of these out for a lot of our customers. So as the enterprise environment becomes more complex, right, it's more important that we monitor things, and then we need to store them for longer periods of time and look at them in more complex ways historically, right, both for threat hunting, but also maybe modeling the growth of the network or figuring out, you know, where we can get the most bang for our buck for our security dollars, right? So it's desirable to put all of this stuff in one place and keep the data in a holistic way that allows the elimination of a lot of the data silos we spoke to earlier, right? So we think this is going to be this fantastic Eden garden for us to go and find all kinds of insights about our environment. But more often than not, we end up with something like this, where you know, we end up with a lot of disparate, disorganized data that's difficult to gain value from. Why? Right? So a lot of organizations came running all in on these data lakes, whether that's Elastic or parts of the Hadoop ecosystem, Spark and Storm, and they all come in and say, okay, we're going to throw all the data into it, and then we'll see what we get, right? And unfortunately, that didn't work, right? We end up with lots of data that we don't know what to do with, that's hard to work with. It needs to be reorganized or redone in some way. And so our data scientists end up spending 75% of their time or more cleaning that data, deduplicating it, and adding base value to that data so that they can go and then go and do the analytics that they want, right? So what do we need to do this right? So we need to figure out what are the use cases we're trying to solve with the data that we're putting into the data lake, right? We want a good understanding of the business problem, and that will allow us to decide, are we bringing in the right data? Do we have the right metadata to work with it to do what we want? The next thing we need to make sure we do is we need to manage the data lake well. What this means is that we have the right team of people maintaining it, right? Not just keeping those clusters and that data or those systems alive, right? That would kind of be our data custodian who has the technical accountability for having the data and the infrastructure available and that they understand the tools that are being used. But the business also needs a data steward, right? That's the person who's accountable for ensuring that the data is maintained in a way that it gives maximum value to the business, right? Next, that data ingest path needs to be easy, right? We're going to potentially bring in high volumes of data at high speeds. And we need to figure out, do we need to offer batch or streaming capabilities for our analytics? So all of that's going to boil back down to the use case. Ideally, we should have an ability to onboard and offboard data very quickly with minimal workflow on the human side, minimal processing requirements. So in short, kind of easy on, easy off, right? And then we need to make sure that that data is organized. Right? Just enough organization taxonomy so that the data can be discovered and worked with. And it's going to include, data types, time series data, security classifications, origin information, et cetera. Whatever fits with the use case, right? And that's where this is LogRhythm's approach, but this is where the SIEM comes in, right? We've been looking at this machine data for well over 15 years, decorating it, adding value, putting together the metadata, and building a taxonomy that allows us to take a wide variety of data sources and derive meaning and structure out of them, so that you can look for things like URLs or parent-child process relationships, file hashes, or CVEs within there, right? So with that uniform classification, we can work with the metadata instead of the raw data and derive value out of it quicker, right? With our search and machine analytics, right? You don't need to go in and start looking for a bunch of esoteric error codes if you know that what you're looking for is a piece of security data that's classified as an authentication event, and you're looking for successes or failures, right? So we go and enrich all of that additional information, including unique host and user identification, geolocation, directionality, and within our 7.3 platform, we can feed that all out of the SIEM message processing engine and into a data lake, right? So the result is we have a high level of cleanliness and quality to that data for our analysts to work with, right? We have that rich abstraction layer, and people and machines can work with it in a faster, more efficient pattern. So that MDI preparation process, right? This is, we had a similar screenshot earlier, right, where we've got our log data, right? This is what we work with. In this case, it's a tagged XML format. It's kind of cumbersome. Maybe we know exactly what to work with in there with the right set and awk rules. We can get something out of it. But we want to take that data and turn it from this into our semi-structured taxonomy, right? Again, in this case, we've got user information, directionality, and that classification, categorization, and core activity information, so that we can go and look for patterns in the way that people operate, as opposed to how tools log things. So what's the benefit of this single vocabulary, this flexible taxonomy that we're using, right? So this allows us to organize, hundreds to thousands of devices, organize their data in a way that it can be extended further, but that also contains a rich structure that has the potential to unlock and enable a broad set of analytics, not just inside the core SIEM or even just inside your security organization, but for the business in general, right? So when we go back and we think about that as a whole, when we're looking at these use cases, we want to think, how can we leverage this data taxonomy in a way that the business can derive value from? Because that's kind of the core of what we want to put together and provide back, because that's what keeps security relevant and important, and helps us properly communicate with the rest of the organization. So with that, does anyone have any questions? We've got plenty of time to work with. I don't have anything up on the chat window at the moment, but
yeah, everyone feel free to submit your questions through the chat box on your toolbar. At the moment, I don't have anything in here, Jake, but we'll give it a few seconds to see if some things come in.
All right. And then again, I work with the Technology Alliances organization. So if you guys are using your Palo Altos in a certain way, and if you're already a LogRhythm customer and there's something valuable that you feel you're not getting, reach out to my team, and that's kind of where we focus, and we focus on what customers are asking for first, right? So if you don't agree with maybe where we're going with our roadmap, you have the option to influence that. So we're always open to feedback.
Great, thank you, Jake. Last call for questions here, everyone. Again, we'll give it a little bit of time here. All right, and with that, I'd like to give a big thank you to our speaker today, Jake. But before we conclude, if you are interested in learning more about this topic, please do enter your information into the survey evaluation. It will pop up on your screen at the end of the webcast here. Also, please make note of our upcoming webinars and our past webinars by visiting www.fuelusergroup.org. You can also join us at one of our Spark Summits. Information for our events in Boston and Denver is now available on the Fuel website. And then finally, a recording from today's webinar will soon be available on the Fuel website. It's going to be in our resource center. I'd like to thank our speaker and everyone online for attending the event today. Again, there is a survey after the webinar for you to complete. We do thank you in advance for your feedback. So thank you again for attending today's webinar, and everyone have a great day. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Renee. Thanks, everyone.